Today is Founder University Day, and we've got a really interesting speaker and a really interesting topic to talk about today. So we're going to have a few presentations on company culture. This is the first in a series of presentations and expert advice on company culture. Today we're hearing from Reggie Burton, who is the founder of Reggie Burton Communications, or RB Group, Public Relations. He specializes in PR, social media marketing, advocacy, diversity communications, and he's got some pretty notable clients: Las Vegas Golden Knights, Lexus, Centennial Subaru, and the Las Vegas Urban League. Prior to what he's doing now, he directed communications at MGM Mirage, and he had tens of millions in annual advertising equivalency value. So he's actively involved in the Southern Nevada community, and he's made history as the first African-American president of the Southern Nevada Public Television Board of Directors. Now, PBS, for those of us who like acronyms. He's also the founder of Avery Burton Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit advocating for mental health and wellness. So Reggie's going to talk to us today about D&I in the workplace, how it started, and how it's going. Reggie, I can't wait to hear more about the topic. So Reggie, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Yeah, no, thank you for that fantastic introduction. And I really would like to thank Audrey for the invitation to speak with you all this afternoon. This work of diversity and inclusion, it's really near and dear to me, and you'll figure out why as I go through my presentation. I would really love for this to be a conversation that sort of builds up towards the end, where I hope that you have some very specific questions that are unique to your situation. And then we can kind of leave enough time to have a robust Q&A. So with that being said, I'll just kind of dive right in on what we're going to be discussing. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is the topic. I kind of just figured I'd use my own personal experience to kind of tell you what I think it looks like in terms of how it started and how it's going. During this conversation, we're going to go through several topics ranging from social impact, bias mitigation, and D&I. And then I have two case studies that are based on my professional experience working with MGM Mirage, which is now MGM Resorts International, and a current client of mine since I started my own marketing agency, which is the Vegas Golden Knights. So I'm hoping to give you a look at what corporate diversity looks like in that space, and then also Vegas Golden Knights, which you don't think of them as a startup, but they really are the closest thing to a sports startup. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. And then coming towards the end, I'd like to address what I like to call some threats and opportunities, one of those being public policy, and sort of taking a look at DE&I in the era of the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action, and what that might, what the implications of that might mean for your organization, depending on where you are. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview. So we're kind of operating from the same framework of how we're defining diversity and inclusion. So workforce diversity first emerged in the 1960s following the introduction of equal employment laws and what we most now commonly know of as affirmative action. Initial diversity training efforts sort of were the result of that, focused primarily on legislation and compliance based on companies avoiding anti-discrimination lawsuits or through mandated diversity training for non-compliant companies. Next slide, please. So the topic of social impact, let's spend a few minutes on that. So social impact has sort of broadened its reach to include what we would know as environmental impacts, specifically in the areas of water, energy, and general conservation efforts. A new phrase has evolved from this work, and I think we most commonly know it as CSR, but it's corporate social responsibility. And then in a broader context of corporate America, DEI philosophies have evolved into environmental, social, and governance, which you might hear more accurately called ESG. And those are and these philosophies can be used interchangeably. So if you hear, CSR, or if you hear DE&I, or if you hear ESG, it's very likely that people can be using those terms interchangeably and they could all sort of mean the same thing. Next slide, please. So let's talk about bias mitigation. When we're talking about bias mitigation, what we're really talking about is how you are using diversity training in your organization to sort of prevent issues that can come up. That these are typically things that you may sit down with your risk management team or your legal counsel to just think about what you should and should not be doing as it relates to your employees. This is a function that will typically live in your human resources department. So whoever is responsible for the hiring in your organization, that person should also be giving some thought to what diversity training might look like for your organization. Next slide, please. So DE&I in the workplace. I wanted to present a couple of case studies to kind of take some of these acronyms and to take some of these phrases that you've heard and see what it looks like when we apply them to a workforce or a workplace. So MGM Mirage is my first case study. I picked MGM Mirage because I'm actually an MGM alum. I joined MGM Mirage in 2005 when I was an employee of a company called Mandalay Resort Group. So backtrack just for a moment, MGM Mirage actually became a company when they merged or had a merger with Mirage Resorts and with MGM to form MGM Mirage. A few years later, as I mentioned in 2005 or so, MGM Mirage acquired Mandalay Resort Group. So let's pause right there and think about the impact of that. So you're taking two companies within the gaming, casino gaming sector, but with two different employee bases and two different corporate cultures, if you will. The MGM Mirage corporate culture was really more when you think about Steve Wynn. Steve Wynn, obviously someone that is very well known with being one of the building blocks of what we know as the casino industry in Nevada and in Las Vegas. Just customer service and all the things that you think about when you think about a gaming property in Las Vegas. It can somewhat be a dotted line back to sort of the influence of Steve Wynn and MGM and Mirage Resorts. With Mandalay Resort Group, being a Mandalay Resort Group employee, I can tell you it was really run more as an entrepreneurial venture with a very scaled down operations chart compared to MGM Mirage. So the challenge for the companies were to figure out how do you gain efficiency. So I'm not going to get into too much of those weeds. What I really want to get into is where the intersection of diversity came. So to counter community concerns over loss of jobs and contracting opportunities to this merger and acquisition activity at that time, MGM Mirage developed a diversity initiative featuring a diversity champions training program to bring about an organizational culture centered on valuing diversity. Now, you might ask, well, why did they do that? Well, I think one of the reasons should appear quite obvious. The attorneys probably sat down and said, look, we're getting a lot of flack from the community. We need to have a strategy to deal with that. So the CEO was on board with it, of course. If the general counsel says, look, we have the risk of lawsuits if we don't address these concerns and these issues, fine. I think that's sort of standard operating procedure for most CEOs. But in the case of Terry Lanny, who was the CEO of MGM Mirage at that time, he wanted to take it a step further and take the approach of, let's just not have a diversity initiative because it's something that's required from a legal perspective, but let's do it because it's the right thing to do. So as you sort of dive into what that meant and how that applied to the company, I think this is really where the benefits of diversity are somewhat understated. It forced the company to think about, how do we serve our customers better? How do we gain greater efficiencies with contracting? How do we buy things at a cheaper price now that we have this merger, and maybe we can do a better job in our sourcing? So the unintended consequence I found of having a strong, solid diversity initiative was that you started to see some greater efficiencies, as well as a greater attention to detail as to understanding who is your customer, who are the people coming to Las Vegas to visit your properties, how can we best serve them, what does that look like in marketing in terms of our messaging. So fast forward, today MGM Resorts International is known as one of the leading companies in hospitality for corporate diversity. And it started with that intentionality. That's a word that I think as founders of your corporations or your businesses, you should really lean into that word of intentionality and think about deeply what that means for you and your business and your industry, and just being intentional about this work of corporate diversity and what it means to your customers and ultimately your bottom line. Next slide, please. So case study number 2. So now I'm going to put my business hat on, because in sharing with you about case study number 1, that was really more of a corporate employee perspective that I was giving you. Now I want to put on a hat that really reflects who I am today, which is a business owner. And I'm using those experiences that I had in the industry of gaming and sort of shepherding MGM Mirage into an era of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm able to bring that to a client that is really more of a startup. So what do I mean by that? Formed in 2017, Las Vegas' first professional sports team opened an office in Summerlin with less than 80 employees. So you're really talking about a company that got this expansion franchise, and before you could even pop the cork on the champagne to celebrate, you had to get to work. So they had to build a building, which is now City National, their corporate offices, and they had to get to the business of filling a roster and adding some employees to run this hockey franchise. Diversity was really nowhere near the top of the list of things to do for not only the hockey people, but for the business people, the people charged with running the business. So after that first year, which was amazing, if you live in Las Vegas and you follow the Golden Knights, you know it was just an incredible season where they were able to go to the Stanley Cup. You come off of that, now you actually get to start to build your organization. And I met with Kerry Buboltz, who is the president of the Vegas Golden Knights, in 2018 at a community event. And he shared with me some of his pain points. And he said, Reggie, basically, I need to figure out how to bring diversity into a sport that's not diverse. Hockey skews 85, 90% white and older male in terms of its demographics of its fan base. And as a result, most of the teams in the National Hockey League, their office ranks reflect that as well. So he understood what his challenge was, but he didn't quite know where to go or how to wrap his arms around that. So he and I met for coffee. I went by his office, got a chance to kind of walk through the office space, and it was very quick. It didn't take long for me to quickly realize that they really needed sort of a crawl, walk, run approach to incorporating diversity into their organization. Why do I say it that way? Because the tendency is if you try to do too much and try to get over your skis, to use an analogy, then you don't end up doing anything well. So my advice to the Golden Knights was, let's focus on 1 or 2 or 3 things that we can do well, and then we'll go from there. It's kind of like there's a quote from Wayne Gretzky, one of the top goal scorers in the National Hockey League, and he answered a question in a way that I think correlates to business. Someone asked him, what made you such a great goal scorer? Well, Wayne Gretzky's response was, I don't stand and wait for the puck. I go to where the puck is headed. And that's how he puts himself in position to score the goal. So in the case of the Golden Knights, our journey started very simply with intentionality. What are the pain points? What are the problems we are trying to solve? One, they wanted to connect to the minority communities because the overarching goal for the National Hockey League was to grow the sport. So we developed partnerships with minority organizations of influence to help us meet some of those goals. Second, we needed to figure out, how do we develop an approach or a strategy to bring diversity from an ethnic diversity standpoint into the organization? So we started with offering scholarships to high school seniors to 3 minority chamber groups: the Asian Chamber, the Hispanic Chamber, and the Urban Chamber. We specifically identified those chambers because we had to go exactly where we needed to cultivate those relationships to begin that process of creating some energy around HR and creating awareness around opportunities to work for the Vegas Golden Knights. From a marketing standpoint and a community engagement standpoint, the team had developed cultural theme nights that we began to market. Those included Lunar New Year, Hispanic Heritage, and Black History Month. Talked about the scholarship program. We also did hockey clinics in underserved communities, again, with the goal of growing the sport. And then ultimately, we started building ball hockey courts, which allowed for more engagement, where kids could get together in their communities with not pucks, but sticks and little balls and nets that you can actually play simulated games of hockey. So today, VGK has evolved its diversity initiative into a CSR program that now includes the impact on the environment. Why did we pivot to that? Because we're now building things. If you come out to Henderson, where I'm at, my office is on Water Street. Just up the street is First America Credit Union facility, which is a hockey rink, a community hockey rink. There are 2 sheets of ice in there so the community can come in and play and participate in hockey. But more importantly to the Knights, they also have a practice facility for their AHL or the Silver Knights franchise. So it's serving 2 purposes. The next project, also a partnership with the city of Henderson, was the Dollar Loan Center Arena. home of the Silver Knights. So now you have this company that is now building projects. So there's environmental footprints that go along with that, in addition to what's happening at T-Mobile Arena. And more importantly, there are 2 more projects that are in the works to add 4 more sheets of ice at 2 different facilities around the Southern Nevada Valley. So as we roll those out, we'll be thinking about the environmental impacts on those projects. Next slide, please. So now that you've seen some of the applications for diversity with those 2 case studies, let's talk about threats and opportunities. As many of you probably have heard, the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled affirmative action is unconstitutional in higher education as it relates to universities and colleges using any measure of someone's ethnicity or their diversity or diversity in their admissions process. Now, groups are taking a look at diversity programs and programming in corporate hiring in corporate America. So those are impacts that as a business and as corporations start to look at growing and expanding, you have to start to think about. Next slide. So what can you do? So I think the most basic thing I think we can do, and we can talk through this in more of a conversational format and answering your questions, but I think the most basic thing that you can do as startups and sort of founders is incorporate diversity into your organizational culture from the onset. That's going to help ensure alignment as you move forward and as you grow. Human resource recruitment should be intentional. There's that word again, intentional. Be thoughtful about what you want your workforce to look like based on your business goals and needs. In terms of just some basic building blocks for your HR unit, focus on attracting, developing, and retaining that diverse talent. If you try to do one without doing the other 2, or if you try to do 2 without doing the third one, ultimately that person is not going to be satisfied and they're going to leave your organization. I see that a lot when I go around the country doing consulting and diversity training. I see that a lot, particularly in the tech sector, in the technology industry. There's not quite the alignment between the overarching goals of bringing diversity in their organization with the intentionality of creating that environment that people not only will want to come, but they'll want to develop and they'll want to stay. So with that being said, final slide, please. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'd like to open up to Q&A.
Thank you, Reggie. So we do have a couple of questions from Maggie. How long should the crawl, walk, run process take, and how long did that take for the Golden Knights?
Great question, Maggie. That process, the timing of it really depends on you and your organization and your business goals. In the case of the Golden Knights, when we meet, we always talk about it in the context of this sort of diversity initiative being like this teenager, and it's sort of growing, maturing. The voice starts to get a little deeper. They start to get a little body hair, and they start to, their stride starts to gain a little bit more confidence. Your journey on your diversity initiative is very similar to that teenager. You're going to continue to grow and you're going to see different things. So before you can start to run, I think you just need to evaluate, how are you crawling? How are you walking? Are you walking straight up? Do you have any hitches in your giddy up? I think those are the things you want to evaluate as KPIs along the way before you put on those sneakers and start to run.
Great. And so this next question it expands on it, but did the plan evolve over time for the Knights, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, so I think, and just to be completely candid and transparent, I think there's been hits and misses. And you may have heard about some of the misses. We've had not only at the National Hockey League level, but we've had major negative PR implications with rolling out some of these cultural theme nights, particularly around Pride Night. It hasn't necessarily been an issue for us here in our market, but it's been an issue around the National Hockey League, to the extent where some teams have said that they just don't want to do Pride Night. And the players have expressed that they have just been uncomfortable with it. Now, my view is that the Golden Knights are doing a really solid job of being intentional and doing it in a way where the players feel fairly comfortable and the community partners are seeing some benefit. So what do I mean by that? How do I quantify that? So with our cultural theme nights, the players wear a warm-up that represents that theme. So in the case of Pride, typically it will be something with the rainbow flag infused into a design of that warm-up. I'm sure you probably have seen them if you've been to a game in the past few years. Players will wear those warm-ups during their pre-match skate, and then those warm-ups will be auctioned off for nonprofits. So there's money being raised through that process. So that really encompasses a corporate social responsibility initiative where you are supporting your community partners in a tangible way. Same thing for Lunar New Year, and most recently, Black History Month. I think where we have struggled a bit is on the HR side, and that's bringing people into the sport. I don't know that we've reached our goal of running yet. We remain intentional. We are sort of casting our net a little bit wider in terms of trying to be more engaging, like bringing students in from historically Black colleges, for example, to spend several days here in Las Vegas. They get a very high level. These are mostly graduate students from this particular program called the DREAM program. And they're getting a very high level of insight into sports business. Now, keep in mind, the Golden Knights are still a very small organization with a couple of hundred employees, which is up from the 80 or so and just a few cubicles that they had in 2018 or so. But they're still a small organization, and they can still benefit from hiring more people, especially at the manager or above level. We do have an Asian woman who is now the VP of Human Resources. So that is progress. We've missed out on some other positions we were hiring for at manager and above, but the intentionality is still there, and we'll still continue to do the work. And I do want to add, I mentioned that we're building things now. Construction diversity is also part of that conversation. Who are the women and minority-owned contractors that we need to be talking to and outreach to help us build our new facilities and give them a shot and an opportunity to do business with us?
Great, thank you for that answer. So next question. In your opinion, are the best DEI strategies founded and rooted in senior leadership, or developed organically in the teams on the ground that encounter them the most? And do you have an example?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to my roots with MGM Mirage. I'm very much a top-down person when it comes to this work. And Terry Lanning was our CEO at MGM Mirage when I worked for the company. I worked for the company from 2005 to 2010. My last big project was City Center. Terry Lanning, to me, was a great example of a CEO with a top-down philosophy where he understood that if he did not give energy to a corporate diversity initiative? Because here, look, here's the reality. Not everyone's going to be on board. Newsflash, not everyone's going to be happy with the choices that the corporation is making, and it ranges. Hey, I'm not LGBTQ, so why should I care? All right. But Terry Lanny understood the research. He had a little bit of Wayne Gretzky in him. He knew where the puck was going. So he didn't wait for the puck to come to us. He knew where it was going. So we just kind of followed the puck in terms of what we were seeing in the marketplace with diversity and where our customers were coming from, international customers, Hispanic, African-American, Asian, et cetera, and he embraced it. And by him embracing it, sort of with the top-down ethos, then the managers, they started out like this with the arms folded, and eventually, once they got the data points and understood, they started to do this. And there's one example that I really love to share with people that illustrates that point. We were building, I want to say ARIA. So we were kind of in the research and development phase of that whole complex. And it was a very complex project. But we did some research. And one of the things we uncovered is that through our diversity initiative, one of the data points we realized is that in the travel sector, travel industry, women made 75 to 80% of the decisions on where people travel. 75 to 80%. Why would you ignore 75 to 80% of the people making decisions about where they're going to spend money? So the result of that was a greater emphasis on understanding what the female customer wanted, right? Because she was going to decide where you were going to stay, MGM, Mandalay Bay. She was going to decide the kid's going to get the suite, how much money you're going to spend. Are you going to play, is the hubby going to play golf, round the golf? So we started to incorporate that into our marketing. So you go to nowadays, and this is a great litmus test, you go to a casino if that's your thing. Notice at the slot machines where there's now a place for women to put their purse. They can hang their purse underneath on a hook at the slot machine. And that's the growth of researching and understanding your customer. And it's all a result of diversity and inclusion.
That's so important. And it's so important to know who your audience is. Okay, great. So next question. What considerations are important to avoid losing market share / the customers as did companies like Bud Light or Target?
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to the run or crawl, walk and run, right? I don't know what kind of sneakers Bud Light was wearing, but it seemed like they were trying to run before they were ready. And so in a little bit of levity, but in all seriousness, you do have to be very measured in your approach. Coming out of this conversation that we're having, not everyone's going to be able to replicate or duplicate what the Golden Knights are doing and doing successfully. You can look at it and you can sort of take some best practices, but you may not be able to completely replicate that for your industry. Same thing with the examples that I shared with MGM Mirage. Different industry, different cultural values, different customer segments that you're serving. So you just have to be mindful of not getting too far out front. Do what is comfortable to you and do what can be measured. And then once you measure and see if you are hitting some of the points and some of the KPIs, then maybe you can do more the next year. And then once you measure that, then maybe you can do some more the next year. I guess my biggest cautionary tale for all of us here in having this conversation, don't try to do too much.
Thank you for that. Okay, great. So how might you address resistance or pushback from team members who may be skeptical about DEI initiatives?
Yeah, so I run a marketing agency, so I have access to lots of really good data, but sometimes that's not enough. You have to use it. And I think for me, I think you always fall back to the data. The reason I say that is because these issues can get emotional. And I think you're fighting against sometimes your staff or your team's own bias or their own discrimination, if you will. And for the record, I don't think there's anything really wrong with being discriminating. I think, we all do it, so to speak. We all discriminate. I go to a restaurant, I order a certain meal. If I order Italian and I didn't order the Asian, am I discriminating against the Asian cuisine? No, it's just that I wanted Italian, right? So I think these are sort of common sense approaches that we need to have in doing this work. So for me, understanding all that, lean in, not with emotion, lean in with data. So what does that look like, Reggie? Hopefully that's not a question. But what it looks like is this. In the travel segment, one of the things we looked at is who are our customers and what are those travel characteristics? So let's just take the African-American travel segment. They typically like to travel in groups, and they like to do things that sometimes can be historical, like museums and things of that nature, learning history and stuff like that. Food is a big part of that experience when they come to a property, what kinds of restaurants, and food that they may be used to, food that they may like. If they're coming from a southern state, maybe you incorporate greens and collard greens and black-eyed peas and things like that into your menu. That demonstrates a level of cultural competence. And when you lean in with your cultural competence, then at some point, you're going to start to see less resistance because it's going to be less emotional reaction to whatever actions that you're trying to take or initiatives that you're trying to incorporate. And people will just fall back and say, you know what? That makes sense. Let me go ahead and put a hook under the slot machine for that woman's purse.
Great. Okay, and last question. Are other teams following the Knights' lead? The sport itself is very white dominated, so is the league implementing anything at their own management level?
Yeah, so this is a bit of job security for me. Sadly, I think the NHL is in a place where they are getting in their own way. Unfortunately, I think the goal, what I've tried to do is have the Golden Knights counsel them to lead from ahead and not from behind. In other words, the NHL has a certain guidance around what they call hockey is for everyone. That's their corporate initiative for bringing people into the sport. I don't care for it too much. Be careful with your hashtags. Hashtag hockey is for everyone. What that means to me is that you have declared the war is over before the first shot has been fired. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll use the example that I just shared earlier. Why are players opting out of Pride Night? Why didn't you think that through a little bit more? If you're saying hockey is for everyone, but it's not even for your players. That aspect of that initiative is not even good enough for your players. Your players are not even on board. So how do you expect fans and other people to be on board when your players are just saying, nope, I'm not wearing it. Religious reasons or whatever the reasons they want to use. So that's the part that can get somewhat frustrating, is that the league sort of got over its skis and moved too fast. In my opinion, they should not be doing sponsoring tournaments for, trans and other, other groups. There's different ways to outreach to those groups without moving it so far ahead that you can't manage it. in my opinion, you should not be doing those sorts of things until you have addressed some core basic issues. And I'm not talking inside baseball here. Anyone can do a Google search and search up hockey and sexual harassment lawsuits. Anyone could do that right now, and you'd pull up a number of issues that hockey is experiencing, going all the way down to the youth level. So my counsel to the Knights has been, let's get our culture right. Let's get sticks in the hands of kids, teach them how to play together in fairness without all the hazing and all some of the other stuff that is part of the sports culture. Keep in mind, hockey came from Canada. No offense to anyone from Canada, but that culture, they're still struggling with some of the issues of the legacy culture of where the sport started and where it is now. To sum it up a different way, hockey is somewhere in the middle of its future and its past, and it's not quite there yet in its future. So I think, I think in the case of the Golden Knights, I'm very comfortable with our direction because we're leading from ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Reggie, for your time and for your insight. I'm going to hand it back over to Jeff, who is going to close us up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Reggie. This talk was really informative. And man, you are right at the leading edge of some of these issues that are so difficult, and you're approaching it with such thought and wisdom. And thank you so much for sharing that with all of us. And Founder University now has an online portal that covers all of the topics that are in our whole speaker series, this one and all the other ones that we've done. Founder University registrants can also gain access to our online community that includes all the curriculum and access to the resources that are recorded here and a bunch of other resources. And just a quick reminder that all the attendees to come to at least 70% of these sessions will be set up with a deal room template that's hosted by StartUpNV, so that when you do get out there and start raising capital, you'll have a good place to share all of the information about your company with potential investors. So once again, I want to thank Reggie for coming out today and talking to us about this topic and sharing some really, really practical, real world examples of how to deal with our evolution on these topics. So thanks again for doing that, Reggie. With that, I will say I'll bid you adieu, and until next time, take care of yourself, and if you can, somebody else too. So long.
Thanks, everyone.